Victoria Hunter had always considered her mountain property a sanctuary, a place untouched by time, a piece of land she had inherited from her late father, who had spent years preserving its raw beauty. She wasn't the type to visit, often life in the city kept her busy, but every time she did, she felt a deep connection to the dense forest, the crisp mountain air, and the silent vastness that stretched beyond the tree line. It was a place where no one could reach her, a retreat from the noise of the world, an expanse of land that belonged solely to her. The drive up the mountain had always been the same. The winding dirt road, the occasional deer darting through the woods, the scent of pine so strong it felt like stepping into another world. As she turned onto the final stretch leading up to her property, she felt that familiar sense of homecoming. But something was different this time. The first sign was subtle, almost easy to dismiss tire tracks in the dirt where there shouldn't have been any. At first she reasoned it could have been hikers or campers who had wandered too far, but as she drove further, unease started creeping in. It wasn't until she reached the clearing near the entrance to her land that she saw it. A structure stood where there had once been nothing but trees. A cabin, small but clearly well-built, stood proudly as if it had always been there. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, and a pickup truck was parked off to the side, partially hidden by the tree line. Victoria pulled her car to a stop, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. This couldn't be happening. For a long moment, she simply sat there, staring at the building in disbelief. She hadn't authorized any construction on her land. She hadn't sold or leased out a single acre. And yet, here it was, a structure, fully formed, occupied, and disturbingly permanent. Someone had moved onto her property, and they had done it so confidently, so brazenly that they hadn't even bothered to hide it. Victoria exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think rationally. Maybe there was an explanation, a mistake in land records, a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had been given the wrong information. She reached for her phone, intending to take pictures before doing anything else, but just as she raised it, the cabin door swung open. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. In one hand he held a coffee mug, steam rising from it into the cold morning air. He squinted at her, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to place her. Then he smiled. "Well, hey there," he called out, his voice friendly but firm. "You lost." Victoria kept her phone in hand but lowered it slightly, assessing the situation. The man didn't look startled or guilty. In fact, he looked almost amused, as if she were the intruder, not him. "This is my land," she said, stepping out of her car. Her voice was steady, controlled, despite the irritation brewing inside her. "Who are you? And what the hell is that?" She gestured toward the cabin. The man took a slow sip of his coffee, then glanced at the cabin as if he were seeing it for the first time. That he smirked. "That's my place." Victoria's stomach twisted. "Your place?" "That's right," he said, leaning against one of the wooden porch beams. "Been living here for a while now. I gotta say, it's a great spot. Quiet, secluded, good for business." Her pulse kicked up a notch. Business. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the truck parked near the trees. "You're not the first to come poking around. Had a couple from out of state last weekend. Nice folks. Left a 5-star review." A cold, sinking feeling washed over her. "You're renting it out." The man shrugged. "People love a good cabin getaway. Can't blame him. Got it listed on Airbnb. Pretty decent income, actually." Victoria's grip on her phone tightened. "You built an illegal rental on my land and started making money off it." The man let out a short chuckle. "Illegal? Now, I wouldn't say that. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to mountain properties. Boundaries shift. Maybe you think this is yours, but there's always room for interpretation." "There's no interpretation," Victoria snapped. "I own this land. I have the deed. I have the records." The man exhaled through his nose as if mildly amused by her insistence. "Paperwork's a tricky thing, but if you got all that, you should probably go sort it out with the county instead of standing here accusing me." Victoria took a step closer, her jaw clenched. I don't need to sort out anything. You're trespassing. You built this without my permission. You need to leave. The man studied her for a long moment before setting his coffee mug down on the porch railing. Tell you what he said, rubbing his hands together. Why don't you take a little time to think on this? Maybe talk to a lawyer, see what they say. Meanwhile, I'll be right here, running my little business. I'd hate for this to turn into a hassle for both of us. The sheer arrogance in his tone made her blood boil. He wasn't just trespassing, he was daring her to do something about it. Without another word, she turned on her heel and headed back to her car. She needed to be smart about this. Marching in with threats wouldn't get her anywhere, especially not against someone who clearly felt untouchable. There were legal channels, steps she could take, and she intended to take them. As she drove away, her mind raced. The first thing she would do was check the county records, confirm that her land was still fully in her name. Then, she'd find out exactly how long this stranger had been living here, how deep this scam ran. Because one thing was certain, he hadn't done this overnight. Whoever he was, however he had justified it to himself, this wasn't some innocent mistake. This was deliberate. And Victoria wasn't about to let it slide. Victoria gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove down the winding mountain road, her mind racing with every possible scenario. The audacity of that man standing on her land, sipping coffee on her porch, treating her property like it was his own, set her blood boiling. He hadn't even looked concerned. No excuses, no apologies. Just that smirk, that unbearable calmness, as if he knew something she didn't. It wasn't just trespassing. It was something calculated, something she didn't yet fully understand. And that made it even more dangerous. The first stop was the county office. Victoria had no doubts about her ownership, but she wanted to make absolutely sure there was no paperwork loophole, no hidden technicality that he could use to twist reality in his favor. The building was old, the kind with creaky wooden floors and filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. She approached the front desk, where a tired-looking clerk barely glanced up from his computer screen. I need to verify property ownership for a piece of land up in the mountains, she said, keeping her voice steady. It's mine, but I want to confirm that nothing's been transferred, leased, or altered without my knowledge. The clerk let out a slow sigh, as if this was the most exhausting request he had received all day, and began typing with deliberate sluggishness. After a long, painful silence, he finally looked up. Name and property address. She gave him the information, watching his face closely as he scrolled through the records. Nothing. No flicker of concern, no raised eyebrows. That was a good sign. Still under your name, he muttered. No sales, no transfers. Looks like it's been yours since the inheritance went through. Victoria exhaled, relieved but not entirely reassured. And there haven't been any permits issued? No construction approvals, no rental agreements filed. He clicked a few more times, then shook his head. Nope, nothing official. That meant everything the man had said was a lie. The rental business, the gray area he had smugly hinted at, it was all a bluff. He was squatting, and he had no intention of leaving voluntarily. Is there any record of complaints filed about the property, she asked. Any disputes? Another slow scroll. Another shake of the head. Nothing on file. Which meant he hadn't been challenged before. No one had questioned what he was doing. Either no one had noticed, or anyone who had tried had been shut down before they could take action. Thanks, she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile before turning to leave. As she walked back to her car, she resisted the urge to scream. She had expected some kind of bureaucratic roadblock, some legal headache that would explain how this had happened. But there was nothing. It was simple. Someone had just decided to take what wasn't theirs, and because no one had stopped them, they had gotten away with it. For now. The next step was a lawyer. She had never dealt with property disputes before, but she knew better than to handle this on her own. This needed to be done right. She searched for the best real estate attorney in town and booked the earliest available appointment. By the time she sat down across from Lisa Calloway, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper presence, Victoria had organized all her documents, printed photos of the illegal cabin, and prepared herself for battle. Lisa flipped through the paperwork, nodding occasionally but saying little. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. "This is clear-cut trespassing," she said. "There's no claim to the land, no squatter's rights that would hold up in court. But that doesn't mean he'll go easily." Victoria frowned. "What do you mean?" Lisa sighed. "People like this don't just wake up one day and decide to set up camp on someone else's property. If he's been there a while, it means he's confident. He's either done this before, or he has a reason to believe he won't get kicked out anytime soon. That makes him dangerous." Victoria swallowed hard. She had felt it too, that certainty in his voice, that smug amusement in his expression. He wasn't scared. He wasn't scrambling for excuses. He had expected this confrontation. "What do I do?" she asked. Lisa leaned forward. "You file a formal cease and desist. You serve him with legal notice that he is unlawfully occupying private property. That's step one. If he ignores it, we escalate to an eviction lawsuit. And if he still refuses, we get law enforcement involved." It all sounded so procedural. Like this was just another case, just another name on a legal document. But it didn't feel that way. Lisa must have seen the concern on her face, because she added, "If he reacts aggressively, you don't engage. Don't try to argue with him. Don't go near that cabin alone. You document everything, you let me handle the legal side, and you let the authorities do their job." Victoria nodded, gripping the edge of her chair. "And if he doesn't fight it, then we push him out as quickly as possible before he finds a way to drag this out." 2 days later, Victoria was standing on the edge of her land again, this time accompanied by a process server, a man built like a linebacker, whose entire job was to deliver legal documents without flinching. She let him handle the interaction while she stayed near her car, watching from a safe distance. The squatter stepped out onto the porch again, same as last time. But this time he didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He took the envelope, glanced at it, and let out a slow exhale, rubbing his jaw. Then, finally, he looked up. "You're serious about this?" "Huh," he said. The process server didn't answer, just turned and walked back to the car. Victoria held her ground, watching as the squatter's face shifted, something darker, something colder creeping into his expression. Then, as if nothing had happened, he chuckled softly and nodded. "All right then," he said. "Let's see how this plays out." Victoria didn't answer. She just turned, got in her car, and left. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't argued. He had just accepted it. And that terrified her more than anything. Victoria had expected some kind of immediate reaction after serving him with the legal notice: anger, defiance, maybe even some half-baked excuse for why he had a right to stay. But instead, the squatter, this man who had illegally built a business on her land, had just smirked, given her that infuriatingly calm nod, and said, "Let's see how this plays out." That was what unsettled her the most. It was the reaction of a man who wasn't afraid. It was the reaction of someone who had been through this before, who knew the game well enough to already have his next move planned out, and that made her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite shake. She followed her lawyer's instructions to the letter. She didn't return to the property alone. She documented everything. She stayed in touch with Lisa, updating her on any developments. But for the first few days, nothing happened. There was no response from the man, no attempt to fight back, no retaliation. The cabin was still listed online, and guests still arrived, completely unaware that they were paying money to stay in an illegal rental. Lisa had filed a formal complaint with the county, and Victoria had been assured that an investigation would begin soon. But every day that passed without any visible action made her feel more and more like she was waiting for something to go wrong. Then, one night, something did. Victoria had been sleeping when the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand jolted her awake. Groggy and disoriented, she grabbed it, squinting at the screen. It was nearly 3 in the morning. An unknown number. Her stomach twisted as she hesitated, then finally swiped to answer. Silence on the other end. No breathing, no background noise, just dead air. She sat up, now fully alert. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet of her darkened bedroom. Still nothing. She was about to hang up when, just barely audible, a click sounded on the other end of the line. Then the call disconnected. Victoria stared at her phone, heart hammering. Maybe it was a coincidence, a wrong number, a prank. But deep down, she knew better. It had started. The next morning, Lisa called with an update. The county was moving forward with the case, and an official eviction notice would be issued soon. It should have been good news. Instead, Victoria's mind was still fixated on that call, that eerie silence, that feeling of being watched even though she had been alone in her apartment. She considered telling Lisa about it but decided against it. It was just a phone call. It wasn't proof of anything, and she refused to let paranoia cloud her judgment. That resolve lasted until later that afternoon when she pulled into her driveway and immediately knew something was wrong. Her apartment was on the second floor of a small complex, a quiet building where neighbors rarely interacted. But now, as she stepped out of her car, she noticed something out of place. Her mailbox was hanging open, the door slightly bent. Papers had been pulled out, some crumpled, others scattered onto the pavement below. At first, she assumed it was just a careless mistake by the mail carrier. But as she got closer, she saw that her name had been scratched out on several envelopes. Deeply, repeatedly. A chill ran through her. She bent down, picking up one of the torn envelopes, her hands tightening around the paper as she scanned the damage. This wasn't a random act. It was deliberate. A message. She forced herself to take a slow breath. No panic. No fear. Instead of rushing inside, she did exactly what Lisa had told her to do. She documented everything. She took photos from multiple angles, captured the scratches, the way her name had been violently crossed out. She checked for any missing documents, any sign that something had been stolen. Nothing seemed to be missing. Whoever did this hadn't been after information. They had just wanted her to know they had been there. That night, she installed a security camera outside her door. She wouldn't be caught off guard again. But the worst was yet to come. 3 days later, Lisa called again. The eviction order is official, she said. They have 3 days to vacate, or law enforcement will remove them. Relief flooded through Victoria, but it was short-lived, and if they don't leave willingly, then the sheriff's department will handle it, Lisa assured her. At that point, it won't just be a civil case, it'll be criminal trespassing. That should have been the end of it. But later that same evening, as Victoria sat at her desk, reviewing paperwork, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Airbnb. The subject line sent her stomach plummeting. Your recent reservation has been confirmed. Victoria's hands shook as she opened the email, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It was a booking confirmation, but not for her. Someone had used her name, her email. They had booked a stay at her own cabin. Her breath caught as she scrolled down to the reservation details. The check-in date was set for tomorrow. No. She slammed her laptop shut, her pulse racing. This wasn't just some scare tactic. This was psychological warfare. Someone wanted her to feel powerless. Someone wanted to make her believe that they had control over her life. She grabbed her phone, dialing Lisa's number with shaking fingers. The moment the lawyer answered, Victoria blurted out, "Someone used my identity to book my own goddamn cabin." Lisa didn't waste time with reassurances. "Send me everything," she ordered. Screenshots, emails, timestamps were reporting this immediately. Victoria did as she was told, forwarding the confirmation, then manually checking her email security settings. No breaches, no hacked accounts. Whoever did this hadn't broken into her actual account. They had simply used her name and email to make the booking, meaning they had access to her information, meaning they were watching her. The next morning, she drove up to the property, this time accompanied by 2 deputies from the sheriff's department. The air was thick with tension as they pulled into the clearing. The cabin was still there, as expected, but something was different. The front door was wide open. One of the deputies, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out first, his hand resting near his holster. "Stay here," he instructed Victoria before heading toward the house. She barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on the ground just in front of the porch. There were footprints. Bare footprints. A single line of them leading from the doorway, across the dirt, into the trees. Her blood ran cold. A few minutes later, the deputy returned. "No one inside," he said. "Looks like they cleared out before we got here. But you should see this." Victoria followed him up the steps, her heart pounding. The cabin was the same as before, rustic, furnished, too lived in for comfort. But as she stepped inside, her eyes immediately landed on something new. On the dining table, a single envelope sat waiting. No name, no address. Just a plain, unmarked envelope placed dead center. The deputy opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper. He frowned, then turned it toward her. 4 words. "See you very soon." Victoria felt the room tilt slightly. The deputy exhaled sharply. "Well," he muttered. "That's not ominous at all." Victoria's grip tightened into fists. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about control, about intimidation, and whoever was behind this wanted her to know that the game wasn't over. It was just getting started. Victoria stared at the note, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "See you very soon." 4 simple words, yet they carried the weight of something much larger than just a property dispute. The paper was standard, the kind you could buy anywhere, no fingerprints visible, no sign of smudging or hesitation in the ink. Whoever had written it had done so deliberately, without panic, without second guessing. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was calculated. They wanted her to find it. They wanted her to understand that this wasn't over, that it was never going to be as simple as filing paperwork and waiting for the system to work in her favor. The deputy standing beside her exhaled slowly, running a hand through his short-cropped hair before stuffing the note into an evidence bag. "This doesn't look good," he admitted. "Legally, you're in the right, but I'd be lying if I said this wasn't turning into something else entirely." He met her gaze, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something behind his eyes, concern, maybe even unease. "Are you sure you don't have any idea who this might be?" Victoria shook her head, still gripping the edge of the table, as if she needed something solid to ground herself. "No, I mean, I know who's been living here, but I don't know who he really is. He calls himself Daniel, but that could be a lie. I don't know where he came from or how long he's been running this scam. I don't even know if he's working alone." The deputy frowned. "We ran a check on him based on the name you gave us. Nothing came up. No rental licenses, no tax records, no property claims. Either he's very good at staying off the grid, or that name is completely fake." A pit formed in Victoria's stomach. Of course it was fake. People like him, people who moved through the world with that level of confidence, who set up entire businesses on other people's land without blinking, didn't just exist in the system like everyone else. He was a ghost. A professional. Which meant that no matter what legal actions she took, he already knew how to stall, evade, and manipulate the system to his advantage. And that meant she had to think ahead. She straightened, forcing herself to focus. "What happens now?" The deputy sighed. "Officially, we logged this as evidence. You've got the eviction order, and now you have a written threat. That gives us more reason to keep an eye on him, but unless he physically threatens you, we're still in a legal gray area." Legal gray area. That was the problem, wasn't it? Laws were built for normal disputes, fence line disagreements, unpaid rent, zoning violations. They weren't designed to handle people like Daniel, who operated outside the boundaries of normal behavior, who anticipated every move before it even happened. The law wasn't a shield in situations like this. It was a game. And right now he was winning. She thanked the deputies and left the property, but as she drove away, a heavy sense of unease settled in her chest. She wasn't scared. Not exactly. It was something worse than fear. It was doubt. Doubt that the law would be enough. Doubt that she was dealing with someone who would ever leave quietly. And as she pulled into her apartment complex, exhausted and emotionally drained, she barely noticed the small, unfamiliar car parked near her building, not until she saw who was sitting inside. Daniel, sitting behind the wheel, one arm resting on the open window, looking as casual as if he had every right to be there. He didn't move when she stepped out of her car, didn't make any effort to hide himself. Instead, he just tilted his head slightly, smiling that same infuriating, smug smile she had come to hate. Victoria's stomach twisted, but she refused to let it show. She walked toward her building, pretending not to see him, even though every instinct in her body was screaming that this wasn't just a coincidence. She made it inside, locked the door behind her, then immediately went to the window. He was still there, waiting, watching, not making any moves, just reminding her that this wasn't over. She pulled out her phone, fingers tightening around it as she dialed Lisa's number. The lawyer picked up on the second ring, her voice brisk but calm. "Victoria, what's wrong?" "He's here," she said, forcing herself to stay steady. "Daniel. Outside my apartment. He's just sitting there, staring at me like he knows I can't do anything about it." Lisa swore under her breath. "All right, listen to me. Don't go back outside. Don't engage with him. I'm calling the sheriff's department right now and reporting this as harassment. If they can't remove him, we'll escalate it. He's trying to intimidate you." Victoria exhaled sharply, trying to ignore the cold weight in her chest. "It's working." Lisa's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "No, it's not. He wants you to feel powerless. That's his game. But he's getting sloppy, which means he's nervous. He wouldn't be here if he wasn't starting to feel the pressure." Victoria wasn't sure she believed that. Daniel didn't seem nervous. He seemed amused, as if he had already decided how this would play out. The police arrived within 20 minutes, but by the time they pulled into the lot, Daniel was gone. That was when she realized just how deep this went. He didn't just want to scare her. He wanted her to know that she couldn't stop him, that he could be anywhere, anytime, watching without consequence. Lisa filed an official harassment report, but when Victoria asked what more could be done, the answer was depressingly familiar. Unless he commits a crime, there's not much we can do besides document everything. You need to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. If he shows up again, call the police immediately. The more we build a case, the better your chances of getting a restraining order. A restraining order. A piece of paper. A fragile, meaningless thing that wouldn't stop a man like Daniel if he truly decided to push things further. Victoria spent that night sitting on her couch, every light in her apartment on, her laptop open in front of her as she scrolled through every single review of the illegal Airbnb listing. She combed through the guest comments, the photos, the little details left behind by unsuspecting visitors. Most of them were positive. People loved the secluded atmosphere, the off-grid experience, the rustic charm, but there was something else, two small things that most guests wouldn't think twice about. A woman mentioning how the host was always nearby if you needed anything, another person commenting on the handwritten welcome notes that appeared in the kitchen upon arrival, even though the host never formally checked them in. And then she found it. The worst review, one that had been buried under all the glowing ones. Felt uneasy the entire time. Something about the place just felt off. My girlfriend woke up in the middle of the night and swore she heard someone outside, but when we checked, there was nothing there. Next morning, we found fresh footprints in the dirt right outside the window. Definitely wouldn't stay here again. Victoria's stomach turned. Footprints. Watching from the woods. Always nearby. Daniel hadn't just been running a business. He had been watching them too. Victoria barely slept that night. Every noise outside her apartment made her sit up, heart hammering, fingers gripping the edge of the blanket as she forced herself to breathe, to remind herself that Daniel had no legal reason to be here, that the police had taken her report, that this was still a fight she could win. But deep down, something had shifted. She wasn't just dealing with a squatter anymore. She was dealing with a predator, a man who had made it clear that the law wouldn't stop him, that he wasn't going to simply pack up and walk away. And worst of all, he was enjoying this. He wanted her to feel cornered. By morning, exhaustion settled deep into her bones, but she forced herself into action. She needed more than legal steps now. She needed proof, something concrete that would force the authorities to intervene before things escalated any further. She spent hours combing through every detail of Daniel's operation, taking screenshots of the Airbnb listing, cross-referencing it with county permits, compiling every guest review that hinted at something off. Then she forwarded it all to Lisa, who responded almost immediately. "We're filing for an emergency order to have him removed immediately. You need to stay somewhere else for a while. He's too fixated on you now. I don't like it." Victoria's stomach twisted at the thought. Staying somewhere else? No. That felt like surrender, like letting him win. But Lisa was right, this wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was personal. Just as she was about to respond, her phone rang. An unknown number. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Another silent call? Another threat? She answered, bracing herself. MS. Hunter, the voice was male, steady, professional. "This is Officer Graves with the County Sheriff's Department. I was one of the deputies assigned to your case. I think you should come down to the station." Victoria's throat tightened. "Why?" A brief pause. "Something's happened." 20 minutes later, she was sitting in a cold, sterile office across from the officer. He slid a folder across the desk toward her. She hesitated before opening it, her breath catching as she took in the photographs inside. Her cabin. Only it wasn't standing anymore. It had been burned to the ground. The air left her lungs in a sharp exhale. The structure was unrecognizable, nothing but charred beams and blackened debris, the surrounding trees scorched from the heat. She flipped through the images, barely processing them before looking back at Graves, when her voice was barely above a whisper. "Late last night," he said. A call came in from a hiker who saw the smoke. By the time fire crews got up there, it was already too late. Victoria swallowed hard. This wasn't just about eviction anymore. This wasn't about intimidation. This was destruction. Was anyone inside, she asked. Graves shook his head. No bodies, no injuries reported. But we're treating it as arson. Her fingers tightened on the edges of the folder. "Do you think it was Daniel?" His jaw flexed slightly. "We don't have evidence yet. But I find it hard to believe it's a coincidence that your illegal squatter suddenly lost his entire setup right when law enforcement got involved." Victoria exhaled slowly, staring down at the photos again. "So what happens now?" "The investigation is ongoing, but I'll be honest with you, MS Hunter. If this guy is as slippery as you say, he's probably already disappeared. He had no legal claim to the property, no paper trail leading back to him. He's not going to stick around to get caught." She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that this was the end of it, that Daniel had cut his losses and run. But deep down, she knew better. Daniel wasn't afraid of getting caught. He was playing a different game. She left the station feeling hollow. The cabin was gone. All of it, the walls, the furniture, every trace of his presence, erased in flames. There was something chillingly effective about it, something that made her realize just how calculated he truly was. If there was no cabin, there was no crime scene, no lawsuit, no public record. He hadn't just destroyed evidence. He had reset the board. And now she had no idea what his next move would be. That night, she didn't go back to her apartment. She took Lisa's advice and checked into a hotel under a different name, paid in cash, and kept her phone off except to check in with her lawyer. The paranoia settled deep into her bones. Every stranger in the lobby felt like a threat. Every passing car made her pulse spike. She was being ridiculous. She had to be. Then, the next morning, her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Beautiful place. Shame about the fire. Victoria felt her stomach drop. It wasn't over. It was never going to be over. She immediately forwarded the message to Lisa, who called back within seconds. "We need to go to the police again. This proves he's still watching you." Victoria barely heard her. Her mind was already racing ahead, piecing things together. The fire hadn't been a last-ditch effort. It had been a distraction. Something to shift focus. Something to make her think the problem was gone when in reality, Daniel was still right here, waiting. She had underestimated him. And that was a mistake she wouldn't make again. Instead of running, instead of hiding, she called Officer Graves and demanded to see the official fire report. If Daniel had planned this as carefully as she suspected, he would have accounted for the usual investigative angles, accelerants, footprints, traces of how the fire had been set. But no one could erase everything. No one was perfect, and she was right. The report confirmed that while no direct evidence linked Daniel to the fire, something had been left behind at the scene. A single set of tire tracks leading away from the cabin, deep impressions in the dirt from a vehicle that had been parked for a long time before the fire started. The tracks didn't match any registered vehicles under Daniel's assumed name. But that didn't matter, because Victoria recognized them. They matched the truck she had seen parked near the cabin the very first time she confronted him. Lisa worked fast, filing a formal request to track down the vehicle, but just as Victoria started to feel like she had an edge, another text came through. "Why are you making this so difficult?" Her breath hitched. He wasn't running. He was still here, and now he was getting impatient. Victoria knew that the next step wasn't going to be legal. It wasn't going to be about court orders or paperwork. Daniel had gone from trespassing to stalking to arson without hesitation. There was only one direction left for him to go. And she had no intention of sitting around and waiting for it. She didn't go back to her apartment. She didn't go to the hotel. Instead, she went to the only place left where she could set the terms: her father's old hunting cabin, miles away from town, deep in the mountains where Daniel wouldn't expect her to go. She wasn't going to be the prey anymore. She was going to end this. Victoria sat in the darkened hunting cabin, gripping the cold steel of the rifle her father had left behind. The familiar weight of it in her hands grounded her, gave her something real to hold on to as her mind raced through every possibility of what was about to happen. She had spent years believing the world operated by rules, that people like Daniel could be stopped through the proper channels, through lawyers and law enforcement. But that belief had been shattered the moment she realized he wasn't afraid of the law. He had burned down the cabin without hesitation, erased every trace of his operation, taunted her with messages just to remind her that he was still watching, that she was never going to be free of him until he decided it was over. But he had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. She had chosen this place because it was the one spot he wouldn't expect her to go. She had never mentioned the hunting cabin to anyone. It wasn't listed on any deed under her name. It was deep in the mountains, accessible only by an unmarked dirt road that most people wouldn't even know existed. But Daniel wasn't most people. He was methodical, relentless. He had found her apartment. He had followed her movements. He would find her here too. And when he did, she would be ready. The hours crawled by, the silence pressing in around her. Every creak of the trees outside made her fingers tighten around the rifle. Every gust of wind against the cabin walls sent her pulse spiking. Then, just as she was starting to wonder if she had been wrong, if she had miscalculated, she heard it. A car engine. The low, steady hum of tires crunching over dirt and gravel, moving slowly, deliberately. Not the sound of a hiker passing through, not the sound of someone lost. This was someone hunting. Victoria rose silently, positioning herself near the window without exposing herself. She saw the headlights first, cutting through the darkness, then the outline of the trucker's truck. He was alone. No backup. Just him. She forced herself to stay calm, to focus. She had spent too long reacting, being caught off guard, letting him control the pace of this fight. Not anymore. She had set the trap. Now it was time to see if he would walk into it. The truck came to a stop about 50 yards from the cabin. The engine idled for a moment before cutting off. Silence. Then the door opened, and Daniel stepped out. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, looking at the cabin, his posture relaxed but expectant, as if he already knew she was inside. As if he had known all along that she would end up here. The thought sent a chill through her, but she didn't let it shake her. She had the advantage now. She was prepared. He started forward, moving with that same effortless confidence he always had, the kind that made her stomach turn. He wasn't armed, at least, not visibly, but that didn't mean anything. He had already proven that he didn't need brute force to get what he wanted. He was a manipulator, someone who twisted reality to fit his own needs. She waited until he was closer before she finally spoke. That's far enough. His head tilted slightly, that familiar smirk creeping onto his face. I was wondering how long it would take you to stop running. Victoria kept the rifle raised, her grip steady. I'm not running. Good, he said, taking another step before stopping again. I'd hate for this to be boring. Her jaw clenched. Why are you here, Daniel? He let out a soft chuckle. You already know the answer to that. She did, but she wanted to hear him say it. She wanted to hear him admit it, to strip away the layers of deception and games and finally be honest. You want control, she said. That's what this is about, isn't it? You never cared about the cabin, or the land, or the money. You just wanted to prove that you could take something from me and get away with it. His smirk widened just slightly. And yet, here we are. You, holding a gun. Me, standing unarmed. Almost like you're the one making the rules now. The way he said it sent a spike of rage through her, because he wasn't afraid. Even now, even with the barrel of a rifle pointed at his chest, he still thought he was in control. You think this is a game, she asked. I think, he said, that you've spent your whole life believing people like me can be stopped by rules and laws and the right way of doing things. And now you're standing here, aiming a rifle at me, because you finally understand that none of those things matter. She hated that he was right. Hated that some part of her had already accepted that this was the only way it would end. You burned it down, she said, her voice steady but cold. The cabin. The business. Everything. You erased it all, so there'd be nothing left to trace back to you. So what do you want now? Why come back? His expression didn't change, because it's not about the cabin. It never was. For the first time, a sliver of uncertainty crept into her thoughts. If it wasn't about the property, if it wasn't about the business, then what was it? Daniel took another step forward, slow and measured, watching her carefully. I've been waiting to see how far you'd go. How much it would take before you stopped believing in the system that was supposed to protect you. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. So this was some kind of test. He shrugged. Call it an experiment. Rage burned hot in her chest. He had put her through hell, had violated her sense of security, had manipulated, threatened, destroyed, and now he was acting like it was all just a game to him. She tightened her grip on the rifle. You're a coward. The smirk finally faded. Careful, Victoria. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to think. She wanted to pull the trigger. She wanted to end this right here, right now. But that was what he wanted too, wasn't it? Not death, necessarily, but for her to cross the line, to prove that she wasn't any different from him. She had spent weeks trapped in his game. It was time to change the rules. You're right about one thing, she said. The law won't stop you. The police won't stop you. But you know what will? He raised an eyebrow, curious. Enlighten me. She pulled her phone from her pocket and turned the screen toward him. A live video feed played, showing him standing outside the cabin. The security cameras she had set up around the property had been recording since the moment he arrived. His expression flickered, just for a second. Clever. You think you're untouchable, she said. But now I have proof. You're here. You came after me, you burned down the cabin, and now you're harassing me on private property. This isn't a civil case anymore, Daniel. This is criminal. And I just sent the footage to the sheriff's department. For the first time, he looked unsure. She saw it, the realization sinking in. He had spent so long controlling the situation, dictating the terms, but now she had the upper hand. He exhaled, shaking his head with something almost like amusement. Guess I should be going? Then, she didn't lower the rifle. Yeah, you should. He hesitated, but then he stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. You win this one, Victoria. But don't fool yourself into thinking this is over. She watched as he got into his truck, started the engine, and drove off into the darkness. She knew he was right. But this time she was ready for him. The sound of Daniel's truck disappeared into the night, leaving Victoria standing in the cold, rifle still raised, her breath coming in slow, controlled exhales. She didn't move, didn't let her body relax, not until she was sure he was truly gone. The weight of the past weeks, the paranoia, the fear, the feeling of being hunted still clung to her like a second skin, refusing to loosen its grip. But for the first time she felt something else, something she hadn't let herself believe in since this nightmare had started. Control. She lowered the rifle and stepped back inside the cabin, bolting the door behind her. The silence was suffocating, but she welcomed it. It gave her a moment to think, to process what had just happened. Daniel had left, but she knew better than to believe that meant he was finished with her. He wasn't the type to walk away from something he considered unfinished. This wasn't just about her land anymore. It wasn't even about power. It was about the fact that she had beaten him at his own game, and men like Daniel didn't take well to losing. She replayed every second of their encounter in her mind, searching for weaknesses, for anything she might have missed. He had been too calm, too composed, even when she had turned the tables on him. There had been a flicker of something in his eyes, not fear, but calculation. He had been measuring her, assessing how far she was willing to go. And that was the most dangerous part. He had left, but he wasn't done. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she kept the security feed pulled up on her phone, watching for any sign that he might return. She checked the locks, rechecked them, then went over every inch of the cabin, making sure there were no vulnerabilities he could exploit. By dawn, exhaustion crept in, but she refused to let it drag her under. This wasn't over. Not yet. By mid-morning, Lisa called. Sheriff's Department got the footage, she said, without preamble. They're officially classifying this as criminal harassment. That means a warrant for his arrest is on the table. Victoria closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. It should have been a relief. It should have felt like victory. But it didn't. That won't stop him. Lisa was quiet for a moment. No, probably not. But it's pressure. And if he's smart, he'll realize he's running out of room to maneuver. Victoria wasn't sure she believed that. Daniel was smart, but he was also obsessive. This wasn't just a scam for him anymore. It was personal. They're putting out an alert for his vehicle, Lisa continued. If he's seen anywhere near you again, they'll take him in. Victoria nodded, even though she knew how little that actually meant. Daniel had proven time and again that he could move without detection. If he wanted to disappear, he would. I'm coming to you, Lisa said. Stay put. For the first time in days, Victoria didn't argue. Lisa arrived an hour later, pulling up in her SUV with an energy that said she had spent the entire drive thinking through every possible angle of this situation. She stepped inside, setting her bag down before leveling Victoria with a sharp look. Tell me everything. Every detail. Every word he said. Victoria did. She told her about the way he had walked right up to the cabin, about his unsettling calm, about how he had never actually denied anything, how he had almost seemed. Intrigued by the fact that she was finally standing up to him. Lisa listened intently, her fingers tapping against the table in slow, rhythmic beats. He's playing a long game, she said finally. He doesn't care about the property anymore. He cares about you. Victoria swallowed hard. I know. Lisa exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. We have to assume he's still watching. He's waiting to see what you'll do next. You can't give him that opportunity. Victoria frowned. You think I should leave? I think you should be smart, Lisa corrected. Right now, he still thinks he has the upper hand. That's why he left so easily. He thinks you're just another obstacle, something he can outmaneuver. But if we take away his ability to predict your next move, we take away his power. Victoria leaned back, considering that. Lisa was right, Daniel was waiting, and if he was waiting, that meant he wasn't done. She took a deep breath. I want him caught. Lisa's eyes darkened. Then we set a trap. They spent the rest of the day laying the groundwork. Victoria would go back to her apartment in town, business as usual, as if she was moving on. Meanwhile, the sheriff's department would monitor any sign of Daniel resurfacing. If he followed her, if he made even one misstep, it would be enough for them to move in. The waiting was the hardest part. Victoria forced herself to stick to the plan, to go about her routine as if nothing had changed. But the feeling of being watched never left her. Every time she walked out of her apartment, she expected to see him. Every time she got into her car, she half expected to find a note waiting for her. But nothing happened. And that was worse. Because it meant he was waiting for the perfect moment. Then, 2 weeks later, the moment came. It happened at night. Victoria had just locked up her apartment when her phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. You look tired. Not sleeping well, her blood ran cold. She didn't hesitate. She called Lisa, her voice low and controlled. It's him. Lisa's response was immediate. Keep him talking. Victoria took a slow breath and typed back. Where you? 3 dots appeared. A pause. Then, wouldn't you like to know? She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. He was close. She glanced toward the parking lot. The area was mostly empty, a few scattered cars under dim streetlights. But then she saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the shadows, too far to make out his face, but she knew. She knew. She didn't move, didn't react, just kept the phone pressed to her ear. Lisa, she said quietly, he's here. Lisa's voice was sharp. Don't move. I'm sending the police now. Victoria stayed perfectly still. The figure didn't move either. It was a standoff, silent and tense, neither of them making the first move. Minutes crawled by, her pulse pounding. Then, in the distance, the sound of sirens. Daniel finally stepped forward, just enough for her to see his face under the streetlight. And for the first time, he didn't look amused. His smirk was gone. His eyes were dark, calculating, but there was something else there too, something dangerously close to anger. He raised one hand in mock surrender, shaking his head like he was disappointed in her. Then, before the police could arrive, he turned and disappeared into the night. But this time he hadn't just vanished. This time they had witnesses. A location, and enough to finally take him down. 2 days later, the sheriff's department tracked him to a motel on the outskirts of town. When they arrested him, he didn't resist. He just smiled. But as Victoria watched from a distance, she knew what that smile meant. This wasn't the end, but it was her win.